Hey, welcome everyone. I'm excited today to welcome Dr. Stephen Hicks. Dr. Hicks is going to join us and talk about a wide spectrum of topics, everything from business ethics all the way to postmodernity. Dr. Hicks, welcome.
Thank you for the invitation, Rick. Pleasure.
Yes, pleasure's all mine. I'm so excited to have you here. We've seen you all over the internet, especially this recent lecture that you gave at the Atlas Society. I think it was the Gulch, I think is the
Galt's
name of the.
Gulch, yeah, it's a
Yeah,
reference
yeah.
from Atlas Shrugged, Rand's great
Yes.
novel. Yeah.
Yeah. And you had a fascinating presentation on this intersection of postmodernism, critical theory, and wokeism. And I was hoping that you could get us kicked off and just tell us how we got here to this point in the West where wokeism and these intersections have really come to a point where we actually want to discuss this in a very public, very frank forum like you did very recently there.
Well, yeah, that's a fun topic. As you're suggesting, it's an important topic. We're all aware of this. We're embroiled in culture wars. What is it to be a decent person? How do I raise my kids, conduct my business? And then what's going on in the world of art and movies, and then perhaps even more significantly with the government force, how we're going to do our politics. So what we call woke is it's an applied movement, and like most applied movements that get big notice, it's a coalition of overlapping ideological perspectives, overlapping issues. The ones that I'm most familiar with are from my perch inside the academic world, are the kind of the high theory positions. Sometimes that's called critical theory in one form. One of its siblings or cousins is postmodernism. And those are academic, intellectual movements that came to prominence first in Europe, but they were fairly quickly transplanted across the Atlantic and spread like wildfire through the Anglo-speaking intellectual world. And so there are some theoretical issues there, and the importance of higher education is training a lot of smart people who then go on into the professions. That can't be underestimated. And the point about just the postmodernism is that it's a highly skeptical movement. It doesn't believe that it's useful to talk about truth or meaningfulness or even justice, that all of those are subjective, usually group subjective constructs that are conditioned into various individuals. And there are different relativized groups that have their own standards. So there's no reason to have a rational discussion about these things or expect that we can sort them out. So ultimately, everything comes down to a kind of power politics, and you just have to make your subjective allegiances lie, so or clear. And so some of the big names associated with that are thinkers like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. And that's some high theory that started in the 60s, but then it captured a significant amount of intellectual life, particularly in higher education, by the 1980s. A whole new generation of professors, and they then, over the next generation, trained a whole generation of further professors, but then also activists in education, law, and so forth. And they burst then out of the academic world in the 20 teens. And that's why, starting to say around 14, 15 or so, we're all aware of this great, huge phenomenon. Critical theory is closely related. It's not as skeptical as the postmoderns, but nonetheless, it does have an understanding of that the Western philosophical tradition, the one that's pro-individualist, that says individuals can govern their own economic lives, so we should have some sort of free market capitalism, or that individuals can govern their own political lives, so we should have a participatory system, some sort of democratic republic, that the scientific enterprise is overall benevolent, that the Industrial Revolution and capitalism have been good. They are coming from a suspicious, cynical, philosophical place with respect to that, and they can join that with an overt Marxism, but it is a kind of neo-Marxism. What's fascinating about all of these high theorists I'm mentioning, Michel Foucault was a member of the French Communist Party in the early 1950s before he broke away. Most of the other leading postmodern theoreticians, you go to the top 10, the top 20, They all were Marxists or very close fellow travelers early in their career. The same is true of the critical theorists, except they also want to not be quite as cynical and skeptical about the failings of Marxism. By now, we're getting to the middle part of the 20th century. They're starting to recognize, even though as youths they were strongly attracted to Marxism and its critique of capitalism and democracy and republicanism, but nonetheless they were social scientific enough to recognize that the Marxist criticisms weren't working out. So they wanted to modify Marxism in various directions.
This is sort of that second generation. This is the Richard Delgado, the Kim Crenshaw, those types of
I would
folks
say
in the
that's
90s.
even third generation. So
Okay.
the original Frankfurt School or critical theorists are 1930s, but then a lot of them are Jewish, so they get out of Germany and Austria with the rise of Hitler. Even though they are Marxists and neo-Marxists, they decide not to go to the Soviet Union. They all decide to go to capitalist America. And anyways, they get well-funded positions there, and they start to exert influence there. Second generation would be someone like Herbert Marcuse in the 1960s, who came to be known as kind of the guru or father of the new left. And he was another German, then American Frankfurt School or critical theorist, who's trying to say we just need to have better social psychology, better social science, and have an upgraded version of neo-Marxism. Now, you mentioned Richard Crenshaw, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw. I'd add Derek Bell to the list as an important person as well. They are then, I'd say, third generation. And what they are doing is taking more general postmodern themes in some cases, but more specifically critical theory themes, and then applying them to particular issues. So you can have critical feminist theory, or you could have critical race theory, or you could have critical environmental theory, or whatever sub issue that you are working on. And then the critical theory philosophical principles become tools in your toolkit if you're working on that particular strategy. Now, all of this skepticism and cynicism and maybe now neo-Marxist activism informs their scholarship to the extent that it is scholarship, but it seriously informs their activist aspirations as well. It also, though, has other roots that are not so high theoretical. The United States and most of the West has long struggled internally with its attitudes over race, over ethnicity, the legacy of slavery, and so on. So there has been another strand in this coalition that just comes out of a somewhat cynical understanding of race relations. There are those who say we're a true believer idealists. We really believe that people should be free, and that the American Civil War and the great efforts of the British liberals to free the slaves and various other movements, that those came out of the Enlightenment. They were genuine, and that we are making progress along all of those lines, and that we should recognize that basically everybody had slavery, but it really was Western civilization that took slavery seriously as a moral sin, as a stain, and did something about it. It's to our credit, primarily, those of us who are inheritors of that tradition, rather than something that we should feel guilt and blame about. But there, of course, has been a more cynical interpretation of that it really wasn't about ideals. It was really about throwing a bone, right? Or it was made economically unnecessary, and that really the racism and the desire to keep certain groups of people down is there. It's just been driven underground a little bit. But that Western civilization is not really interested in liberty and equality. It's about power, and as long as those at the top of the social heap can continue to control the reins of power and get rich, they will tolerate a certain amount of the other racial and ethnic groups, having the appearance of freedom and so on. There also was, by the time we got to the 1960s, some dissatisfaction by well-meaning people about race issues, if we concentrate on those. So they might be willing to say that, okay, the United States and other parts of the West had made great strides, since the 1700s on through the 1800s in getting rid of slavery and getting rid of double standards and cultural evocation And so we really do, mostly believe in judging people as individuals and content of their character and all of that sort of stuff. But there still is this strong residual undercurrent of racism in some parts of the country, and resistance to overturning the double standards and getting rid of the laws. So I always say this is partly well-meaning. A position that came out of the late 50s and 1960s was to say that, okay, we can try to be individualists. We can try to say, yes, we're idealists about liberty and equality and do cultural education, but that's not strong enough. What we need is to have some stronger medicine. We need to basically fight fire with fire for the next, say, one generation, and have affirmative action programs really to break the back of the remaining racism, to get the groups up to everybody equal, to get rid of the double standards, to have equal representation of all of the races and so forth in the major professions. And if we do that, then we will succeed finally in bringing that project to fruition. So basically, from the 1960s to the 90s, we had what I think is a mostly good faith debate about whether we should, just stay the course, teach people to judge people as individuals, get rid of the double standards, judge people by the content of their character, and forget the historical sins, or if we need to have these more group-based affirmative action programs and so forth. And so we had those debates back and forth. So critical race theory is a further turn towards cynicism that you start to see in the late 80s and 1990s. So we then had 20 years of serious experimenting with affirmative action. It wasn't improving the situation. There was widespread reaction and dislike of affirmative action by broad swaths in the American public. By then, been a significant number of court cases that had worked their way through the courts and gotten, in some cases, all the way up to the Supreme Court. And affirmative action was, by and large, being rejected by public opinion, by significant amounts of intellectual opinion, and in the legal landscape. So what you start to see then is a cynical reaction to that by some members in the intellectual community, who believe in more in the group, racial groupings rather than the individual. They think we should have group equality. They've always been skeptical about the commitments of Americans and Western civilization more broadly to genuine liberty and genuine equality. They resist the idea that there are internal social dynamics in the underperforming racial groups, that it has to be because there are outside bad forces keeping them down and so forth. So they tend to see the disappointments and the backlash against affirmative action and the kind of stern finger wagging the Supreme Court is doing, saying that you can't do affirmative action, or at least you can't do it that way. Go back and try again. So they have a more cynical interpretation of all of that. And critical race theory comes out of that. It's then to say, look, we don't think we ever really are going to achieve racial equality. We don't think white people are ever going to give it to us, because that would mean they have to give up money, they have to give up power. So we're going to have a more cynical, activist, anti approach. There's something wrong with the basic institutions of this society, and we need to have an angrier, more physicalistic, more irrationalistic strategy for elevating our people as we see it. And so critical race theory comes out of that, and you see it being formed in the 1990s. Kimberly Crenshaw explicitly says that the name critical race theory comes from critical theory. It comes from Horkheimer and Adorno and Marcuse. Yeah, we are taking that, we're just applying it to race theory. And a lot of the sense that people have that this is another warmed over kind of Marxism, a neo, however many neos you have to add Marxism. There's a lot of truth to that, because this tradition has been cynical about the Western rationalist, individualist, freedom-oriented tradition from the get-go, and they're constantly, each generation, repackaging and re-emphasizing various themes. So yes, so it's a whole coalition then, I would say, the woke. It's a little bit of critical race theory, it's a little bit of critical theory, it's a little bit of postmodernism, And there are some other groupings in there, but it all comes together in somewhat malignant form by the 2010s, and here we are.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So this idea that there's some fungibility about critical theory that you can apply to these different types of domains, and it seems to be the same sort of. I think you used the word tools in your tool case. I mean, it's this
Yeah,
idea,
toolkit. Yeah.
yeah, it's this idea that hey, we're going to give you guys a template for how to go execute this upheaval towards a more contrarian, maybe not even contrarian, but more cynical type of perspective on what is really happening in the world, ignoring the fact that functionally since Wilberforce and Abraham Lincoln, 300 years, 200 years earlier, the slavery has almost been eviscerated worldwide comparatively. I don't know if it's down 90% or what it is by this time, by 1960s. That causes an issue. But I think that the one poison pill that they built in there, Dr. Hicks, and I want to get your thought on this. It seems like whenever they asserted the value by race, that they classified us as racial beings, they begin to remove the independent individual agency of individuals. And the people that were in the hardest situations could not use the typical tool set of a personal drive, of vision, of kind of picking yourself up by the bootstraps to be able to get out of it, because they were told it's not you, it's them. And they've extracted the personal agency from that. How do you read that situation?
That's also exactly right, and perceptive. There's another set of academic disciplines that are not necessarily racialized or victim feminist versions, or just I can't can control my life whatever for whatever religious reason I'm in a religious minority or whatever. If you look at the academic disciplines of anthropology and sociology as they have become more, and even psychology to a significant extent, as they became more serious disciplines over the course of the 1800s and on into the early 1900s. So if we take, for example, sociology as a discipline, and you read into the history of sociology, the idea is there is such a thing as society, and we can do an ology about it. That is to say, we can identify the general principles by which societies are organized. And on the basis of that, we can figure out why some societies go in the directions that they do, others in different directions, and we can make predictions. So this is the idea, is to make a robust social science about this. If you look at the founders of sociology, you come across names like Auguste Comte, the French thinker, or Emile Durkheim and Karl Marx and various others. And they are, you go to Wikipedia or any standard, history of sociology text. These are the founders of sociology. And one of the striking things that they all share in common is this idea that individual agency does not matter, that one is primarily a member of a community, a society, and the society sometimes is characterized even to the extent of being a more organic entity that has a life of its own, and the individual is more like a cell in that society. Or sometimes it has a value component added to it. In the case of, say, Comte and his version of positivism, that the individual has no worth except to the extent that he is a selfless, altruistic servant of society as a whole. Or you see it in Karl Marx, where he says that human beings, their thinking does not have agency. What you think is true, what your values are things that are environmentally conditioned into you in terms of your class membership. And it really is these collective groupings, clashes, that are in collision with each other. And so the idea then is that sociology as a discipline seems to have a lack of individual agency and a kind of strong collectivism built into it as an academic discipline. And you find very much the same thing occurring in anthropological studies as anthropology becomes more social scientific. Individuals are seen explicitly as pawns, born into a different society with dramatically different standards and ways of life, and one is conditioned into that society's way of doing things. And then perhaps the most famous anthropologist is the early 20th century anthropologist at Columbia, Ruth Benedict, who explicitly then draws out the relativized conclusions. We cannot say that any culture is better than any other culture. You can't say that Western civilization is better than any other civilization, or societies that have slavery and societies that don't have slavery are better than or worse than each other, because whatever you believe on that issue is a function of your having been born into a certain kind of social environment, and so you were just conditioned to believe what it is. So we have to totally relativize our understanding of societies, and to a large extent, this then becomes baked into anthropology as a discipline. If you think of the a little bit later, the foundations of psychology as a discipline, the big names here in the early century are going to be the Freudians, of course, following Sigmund Freud and various others, and then the behaviorists, John Watson, B.F. Skinner, and so forth, and more explicitly on the behaviorists. And it's hard to underestimate how much they dominated psychology in the West in the middle part of the 20th century. They, again, have a very strong environmental determinist standpoint. So if you think of all of the experiments that are done with rats and pigeons and so forth, if you just figure out the causal conditions, you can condition the rat or the pigeon to do whatever you want. And it's just going to be the same story with respect to human conditions, just with more variables and more things that we need to work out. So individual agency, aside from the overt politicization that comes from critical theory, or the denial of it that comes from postmodern theory, in much of academic life, coming out of sociology and anthropology and psychology, it gets beaten up on, right? Until by the middle part of the 20th century, latter part of the 20th century, it's hard to find any serious schools of thought in those that are emphasizing individual agency, individual freedom, self-responsibility, and then all of the cultural and so on. So then, as you nicely then put it, to the extent that those are the doctrines that are prevalent, it makes sense that people who are in a difficult situation, I'm born very poor, or I'm born in a racial minority, a religious minority, an ethnic minority, or I'm a woman, and I have additional obstacles right in front of me. It's very easy for that person then to have ready-made excuses, or to be taught, right, and come to believe when they go to college that they are in fact agencyless, that they are products of a culture, and in this case, a dysfunctional culture, and that the reason why that they are not doing well is nothing to do with them, but totally because of external, usually malevolent agencies.
So it almost works both ways. You talked about the attraction to relativistic type of framework, type to worldviews from one side that extracts the thinker himself, or I guess the philosophical leader themselves, from any sort of moral accountability if you follow it to its logical conclusion. But then also they're turning it around and talking about the personal agency to others. And so it seems to me like you've got the same sort of argument, one for the internal person, the relativistic view, usurping the traditional, even back to the Platonic forms of the ideas of the ultimate forms of justice and love and the virtues, all the way back there. They're rejecting that, saying it doesn't really matter. What I think is right, and then they tell others it's okay to do the same thing. In fact, that applies to your local, your job and how you function, even your economic situation.
Well, yes, if you then start to apply it to the value issues, if you think about the value of tolerance, right, or the value of civility, if you think then, as Western liberal tradition has said in the Enlightenment, the important thing is that people are individuals. They have their own minds, they have their own lives, and they should be living freely. But if we're going to do various things socially, then we have to work out the fact that chances are good that your value set is not perfectly aligned with my value set. And also the way that you think about things, since the world is complicated and life is complicated, is that you and I are not going to agree on everything. We'll be, as we're going on our life journeys, working on different theories and so on. But if, as a matter of principle, I want to have my freedom to think for myself and form my own values, respect that I need to do that for you. And that means I'm going to have to put up with the fact that you believe some weird things, right? And that you want to do some weird things. If we can work out enough overlap to become friends or go into business or whatever it is, fine. But if not, then we just have to go our separate ways. So all of that, though, is based on the idea of individual agency and trusting that individuals' minds are capable of working things out. And then if we are trying to work things out together, I have to try to convince you by presenting, oh, here's some facts you might have overlooked, or here are some implications of that hypothesis that you might not have considered, so that you can see voluntarily by your own mind that you need to change your thinking. And of course, you're going to try to do the same sort of thing. But that can only happen if we have civil principles in place, and we're both committed to those principles of civil discourse. But if you don't think people are basically rational, you think they are conditioned by their societies, if you don't think that people have agency, that they are fundamentally responsible, then you're not going to believe in rationality. You're not going to believe in individual freedom. You're not going to believe in individual responsibility. What is the point then of trying to be civil with other people or tolerate differences of opinion? Instead, it's just your view is going to be, I have my subjective set, you have your subjective set, we're never going to get past it, but I want to achieve my goals in the world. So rather than trying to reason with you, I have to force you in some way. And of course, you're going to be trying to do the same sort of thing to me. So then preemptively, I have to make sure that you're not in a position to force me. And then we elevate that to the group level, and we then just see all of society as these competing, power struggling groups. And it's just going not to be any sort of rational, civil, tolerant process, but one in which might ultimately makes right.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And you seem to have this play out from the political spectrum. I mean, we just got done with a pretty important election where Americans are given a certain set of rights, but we're also given a certain set of responsibilities. And if we reject the responsibilities and we say that the rights, I'm going to get as many rights as I possibly can before you get them, sort of the opposite of what you just said, then we begin to find ourselves in an array of chaotic situations where everyone is not only out for themselves, but they're also willing to do less and less to hold their own weight. And I think, and so I've only had one guest on Dr. Hicks twice, and that was Dr. Ben Carson. And so I find that interesting because he can speak about certain conditions of the racial relations that a lot of us probably should not speak of with fear of getting canceled. And he points out
Yeah,
that
unless you're ready to take the heat.
absolutely, absolutely. And he points out that this welfare queen model that is usurped the housewife in certain corners, and he pegs it back to sort of the 1960s, same thing you did, but he pegs it out of the West Coast back to the UCLA school of law, and a lot of the academics there encouraging this rejection of responsibilities in favor of absorption as maximal rights, maximal benefits to oneself. And I think that there's a lot to say to that. I think that aligns exactly what you're talking about, except on the political spectrum. So I guess with all that sort of as a precursor, we just got done with an election. I'm not going to ask you for your political opinions on that, but how do you see? There's been a lot of exit polling that's happened. Instead, a lot of younger men are coming out and voting. It seems like the minorities are changing parties little by little. There seems to be some movement where maybe perhaps for the last 15 or 20 years there has not been any movement there. Do you sense a shift in American perspective on the responsibilities and rights that we are given and we're being held accountable to?
Well, yeah, I think yes, absolutely. The United States and the Western world and the whole world, it's a big place, and things often move slowly. Even in this, internet social media age, things still move relatively slowly. I do think, in one sense, it has been a beautiful thing, the fact that we have had over the course of the last 20 years, rather than a few 100,000 people be aware of what the issues are in the culture and having serious arguments about it, to now millions and tens of millions of people participating in all of these debates. So to the extent that we think we want to have a do-it-yourself participatory society, if having a robust democratic republic is an ideal, then the technological tools that have been available to us are an amazing success stories. Of course, it's a very messy process. Democracies and republics are are always a lot of bruised feelings, a lot of arguments, but it's better than having actual wars and having actual civil wars. We fight it out on social media now, and I much prefer that. But I do think also, yes, yeah, the second part of your comment is right. I think we are at another inflection point. Just if you say the last decade or so, you see that people start to become aware in the culture that the terms of the debate seem to have shifted, maybe around 2013, 2014, 2015, or so. And so all of this right woke stuff right suddenly is in everybody's faces, and everybody is then saying, "What is going on?" Right, this is not necessarily the America that I grew up in or the Canada that I grew up in. And then everybody starts to get self-educated. They start to read all sorts of stuff and go to their school board meetings and so forth. And so now we are about 10 years into that process and a couple of election cycles into that process. And we have had millions and billions of conversations about all of those issues. And one of the ways that we then announce the results of our thinkings is by having elections. And so, yeah, we did just go through an election. I think a part of this recent election is a reaction against the cultural wars that we've been engaging in for the last 10 years or so. Whether it will have long-term staying power, I think that's another issue. But a culture like ours, there's always 60, 70, 80 issues that we're all thinking about simultaneously. Some of them come front burner, some of them become back burner on an ongoing basis. But let me go back to the first part of your question when you introduced the rights and responsibilities language. Since I'm a philosopher by training, I like the big normative concept discussion as well, and I like that a lot more than the nitty-gritty political discussions. But yes, part of the battle is over a concept like responsibility, which is a moral concept. Who is responsible for what? What is my responsibility as an individual, right? As your friend, as a business partner, when I get married, when I become a parent, we're working out issues of responsibility in all of those cases. But the notion of responsibility ties directly into the earlier part of our conversation. I can only be responsible for things over which I have some agency, yes, or over some control. So I think you're exactly right to say that the language of responsibility shifted in some academic intellectual quarters when people were talking about ethics, to the extent that they stopped believing in agency. They had to have a different theory of responsibility. Now, one theory would just be to say, well, nobody is responsible for anything, because whatever happens. It's all a result of God's control. In strong religious forms, the individual is not at all responsibility. If you think we're all puppets in society, then the individual has no agency and so no responsibility, and so forth. But then, as an individual, if you don't believe that you are a being of agency, of power, and that it's up to you to assume responsibility for providing for yourself, then you do start saying things like, well, it is the responsibility of society to provide me with various things, right? Or in religious form, if I think God has all of the power, then it's God's responsibility to provide for me. So all I can do is be a supplicant to God or be a supplicant to society. Give me whatever it is that I need, and I'm not going to take the steps necessarily to try to achieve those things. The same thing happens with the language of rights. Instead of saying you have a right to your life, your liberty, right, your property, the pursuit of your happiness, all of those politically depend on the view of individual self-responsibility. My life is mine because it's my responsibility, it's not yours. And my liberty and my decisions are mine to make, including the consequences for good or bad. My property, it's my responsibility to create property in the first place. My happiness, my well-being, is my responsibility to create. But then if you, again, don't believe that people have agency, you don't believe they have responsibility, but nonetheless, they do have needs. then you start to have to take the language of rights and recast it. Instead of
Mhm.
saying that I have a right to think for myself and take the actions to create the values and make my life what I want it to be, I don't have that responsibility. But if I think those are good things, someone has to give them to me. And so I have them now by right. But it's a very different concept of rights operable at that time.
Yeah. So I have a right to healthcare insurance instead of I have a need
Yeah,
for healthcare.
that's right. Or
Yeah.
I have a right to a job, or I have a right to, yeah,
Yeah.
right to anything. Along the way, you did mention the issue of women and the history of women and feminism. I don't know if you wanted me to respond to that or if that was just a
Yeah.
remark along the way.
Yeah. Please do. Please. I do want to pivot into Nazism after this.
Oh my goodness, that will be quite a pivot. All right, let me just say the same issues with respect to racial issues and ethnocentrism and religious intolerances and so on. In the West, we've been doing the same thing with respect to the status of women. At the beginnings of Western liberalism or the Enlightenment project in the 1700s, that's the first time in history you see people standing up for women and saying that they should have the same freedom rights and the same equality rights as men. And the argument was the same. Women have a brain, they know how to think, they have agency, they can take self responsibility for their lives. We should give them access to education, choosing their own careers, choosing their own friends and marriage partners, and so forth. So all of that comes on board in the 1700s. At the same time, we start to have the great campaigns against slavery, against feudalism, American Revolution, French Revolution, and so forth. So feminism, if we could just call this first wave feminism, is a roaring success and in a relatively short period of time. I always like to remark on just how fast this happened because from the late 1700s to 1920, if we choose that as when the women got the vote at the federal level, that's like a little over a century. And if you think of tens of millennia, tens of thousands of years, every culture in the world, women are second, third, fourth class beings in those societies. To totally transform that in a little over a century is just an astonishing amount of cultural change. But at the same time, within feminism, those debates started to change as the 20th century went on because there was the influence of Marxism. There was the influence of lots of other versions of socialism prominent in the early part of the 20th century. And what you found was, in addition to that more freedom-oriented, individualist-oriented feminism that was now traditional, you started to see more collectivized, socialistic with a small s understandings of men and women, and it started to become more cynical. Just as it's the rich versus the poor. It's the capitalists against the workers. It is now men versus women, and so you started to see more adversarial understandings of what the dynamic was, and there were several sub schools as well. But rather than the idea that men and women ultimately have the same interests, that they can work out win-win partnerships, and they should have the same freedoms, and we're making progress. The idea here started to be that men really want to have the power. They really want to have the control. They think like capitalists, like rich people, and really the women are more like the oppressed proletariat, and they're going to remain in that situation as well. So darker understandings. Now that was through much of the 20th century, and this is worked over territory, first wave versus second wave feminism with lots of subgroups. But you did find critical feminist theories starting to come along in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, just as you started to see critical race theories coming along. And they are explicitly drawing on the postmoderns, they're drawing on the critical theorists, and they're doing to feminism exactly what critical race theory does to race issues. So it's always, as it is, this is high level, kind of a three-way debate over race issues between the individualists and kind of old-fashioned affirmative action type of people and critical race theory. You find the same thing mirrored in the debates over women's status and feminism.
Yes, yes. And let me see if I can segue to us to the other topic. It's always that we as men that are prideful, a community that's always self-seeking, we always veer back that way. That the responsibilities that we have among citizen to citizen, that is always generally in agreement, to treat you with dignity, to treat, to not steal from you, that sort of thing. There's some basic level agreement there, but I think what we often lose is we assent to a horizontal agreement about responsibilities, but we are less likely to assent to a verticality of the responsibilities, whether it be to God or to whatever sort of hierarchical type of lifestyle that you would claim. And the same is true about rights, I think. And this is where we get into the Nazi philosophy, because it was the Jews. It was the Jews that back in Genesis chapter 1 where that told us that God made us in his image. And that's the reason why I think many of the founders perhaps thought that we deserve a certain type of rights, because we have this intrinsic value within us, made in the image of God. And it's a verticality to the right, just like there's a verticality to the responsibility as well, that we often forget. So that whenever I steal from my neighbor, it's because I get the horizontal wrong, because my vertical relationship to his value is offset. And I think that Hitler gave us a little bit of that perspective as well, where he begins to look at his personal needs, and it seems like he sets himself up as sort of a distorted Platonic philosopher king of some sort, and he begins to misuse Nietzsche. And I know that you wrote a book about this, Nietzsche and the Nazis, and it seems to me that there was a collective of Nietzschean Marxist type of philosophy sort of swirling around the epicenter of the Nazi leadership there. How did this philosophical influence begin to take root from your exploration in the minds and the hearts, not only the leaders, but also the country? And how did that progress to where we all know it eventually ended up?
That's a huge complex of interrelated things, but they're all things that one needs to talk about in order to sort out a terrible phenomenon like Hitler. But let me take your first issue about rights, so that we can say have agreements in what you're calling right horizontally, and sometimes this will be in a transactional basis. You do this for me, I'll do that for you, and so forth. And then what I think you're trying to get to with the vertical is that we want to elevate that to a principle. So it's not just every time I run into you, we have to go through this negotiation to figure out if I'm going to be honest with you and you're going to be honest with me, right? And so we kind of have one hand out ready to shake hands, but we also have a hands on the pistol just in case, right?
Yes.
So we don't want to be going through lives like that. So how do we get, so to speak, the vertical? How do we get to a general principle that individual rights are, say, inalienable? And that, I think, is a huge controversy in philosophy. And what you are saying correctly in terms of the history is that one of the theories is to say that the way to get to the vertical is to go to religion, and to if you have the right kind of religious tradition, then you have a being like God, who is your source of knowledge and enforcement, and hopefully a source of goodness, who articulates this principle. And so that since we are under God, we need to respect this principle. So that then is to say, in some sense, rights have a divine origin. And the other principle is to say that rights are like a social scientific principle, that just as human beings, we can do all of this transactional stuff, but at a certain point, because we're smart, we recognize that if we elevate that to a principle, I'm going to be better off and you are going to be better off. So for example, a homey example, once we start having cars and we're driving fast and we've got 1 million people and we're all going in different directions, we don't want every time we come to an intersection to have chaos that has to be, or an anarchy that has to be managed. Instead, we can all recognize that we have the same interests here. And if we then say there are traffic lights and that we're all going to follow the traffic lights, then everything is going to be a lot safer and a lot more efficient and so forth. Now, this principle then wants to say that we're smart enough to figure out a traffic light system, right? and
Which are
to
clearly not.
well, for the most part, we are, right? That we don't need a god or a godlike being to lay a traffic light system on us and to be enforcing it, right? So it can be a natural set of principles that we rationally identify and commit to, and that's of course one of the big debates. Now, I'm on the naturalist side of that debate, and I think the thing to me that's important is the history here, because all of the major religions, even if we just focus on the Western religions for a few moments, despite their theology, did not develop anything close to a doctrine of social rights or political rights for the first 1,500 or so years of their history. You don't see the doctrine of rights as we now understand it. Individuals have a right to life, liberty, property, pursuit of happiness, and so forth, being articulated until in nascent form in the Renaissance, and then more robustly in the Enlightenment. And that's precisely when we started to become more naturalistic, more individual basis, and so forth. Now that's a big debate, and we can have the historical and political discussion about that further on. But I do think it's important to notice that, if you take, for example, slavery, the one that we were talking about before, or the status of women, the religions have been around for centuries, millennia, and throughout all of that history, they basically had no problem whatsoever with slavery as an institution. They had no problem with women being second or third class citizens as an institution. Liberty and equality as principles that we are going to live by are serious products of the modern world. And so I'm leaning, at least in this podcast, towards saying give more serious credence to the naturalistic origins rather than the supernaturalistic origin. But I recognize that that's a debate, and it's one that's worth having. Now, to come to Hitler in particular, yeah, you mentioned some figures like Nietzsche. You mentioned some figures like Marx. I think those are exactly the right guys to emphasize. I don't think, as you mentioned, I wrote a book on this. I don't think that Hitler, Goebbels, and the other National Socialist intellectuals misinterpreted Nietzsche. I think there are significant elements in Nietzsche that are exactly properly interpreted by the National Socialists and worked into their program. The same thing I think is true of socialism and Marxism. Now, the socialism word in there is not just rhetoric. Goebbels loved Karl Marx. He loved quoting from Karl Marx. And when he was young, he was a devotee of Karl Marx. Many of the theorists of National Socialism in the development of the National Socialist ideology in the teens and in the early 20s, even before Hitler joins the party and becomes a serious force, see themselves as Marxist, but neo-Marxist or adapting Marxism, or that there are important elements within Marxism that Marx got right, and we need to incorporate that into the National Socialism. So it is socialism. If you look at the 1920s party program, there's a 25-point program, and I recommend that people go and read this. It's available online at Wikipedia or in any standard history book. And if you just go through those 25-point program, at least 14 of them are about economic matters, and at least 13 of those 14 are policies that are straight socialism. So no socialist would reject that part of the National Socialist Party program. It doesn't matter what brand of socialist you are talking about. So the other part, of course, was the nationalism, right? Is national socialism. So anytime you want to say the whole economy should be organized by the nation or by the state and run by the government significantly for the good of society, you have to say, well, what do we mean by society? And that's where your sociology and your anthropology and your understanding of human nature becomes important. And then for the Nazis, they wanted to say the important society is the nation. It's the German nation, right? And sometimes that's conceived of more in political terms, sometimes more in ethnic terms. And their big debate was to say, look, we don't agree with much with, or disagree rather with the Marxists much about the need for socialism. We just don't think that socialism should be international. We shouldn't be striving for a classless society. It's not like all of the workers of the world uniting. Instead, the right society is at the national level. It's the German workers or it's the Italian workers that need to be uniting. So all of that then is an in-house debate between very strongly collectivized versions of socialism. Should it be pitched at the international level and we need to have a worldwide revolution? That's what the Marxists want. Or should it be at the national level and every nation is going to have its own national socialism? And that's the German National Socialist model as well. So huge amounts are coming out of the left, huge amounts are coming out of socialism. But it's also true that Nietzsche, if you pick on him, for example, he hates socialism. He sees it as a sign of degeneracy. You just want the state to look after you, and oh, poor me, and we have to get together and be like herd like sheep and so forth. So he's much more interested in people living dangerously and putting themselves out there and becoming great artists and great adventurers and so forth. So he has a certain psychological disdain for the socialist approach, right, more generally. And at various points in his development, he thinks that the Germans had something special, when the Germans rose up and imposed their will on the world. But at the same time, he wanted to say it was pretty great when the Vikings rose up and imposed their will on the world, right? And then when the Brahmins and the Arabs and the samurai in Japan rose up and imposed their will on the world, they did something special. They did something great. And it's now time again, maybe for Germany to try to do that again. And it's not going to be, Western capitalism and peace and let's trade with each other and all open our shops and become farmers and peaceful and so forth. He thinks that's not really a life. He wants something that's much more assertive, a lot more bloodthirsty. And so all of those elements, the German Nazis, I think, are picking up on and absorbing into their system as well. Now, for a little while, Nietzsche was more friendly toward German nationalism. He thought there was a revitalization, but he did become somewhat disgusted as his career went on with the direction of Germany. He started talking about being more of a pan-European thinker. Maybe Europe, right, could be doing something special. But we do need a Superman, an overman, someone who will listen to Zarathustra, rise above the sheep, rise above the herd, and he uses all kinds of lion metaphors and wolf metaphors and eagle metaphors. So it's a very predatory ethos that's running through his entire political thinking. And all of that, clearly, the Nazis were on board with. Now, that's to leave out the issue of the Jews so far. So, but I'll kick it back to you to see if we want to plunge into some talk about the Jews and the issues there, or move on to something else.
No, I think it would be fascinating for me to hear you talk a little about any triggering points that you identified that would trigger the onslaught. It's probably a poor word to use, but sort of the kickoff to the death camps. And I think it would be helpful to hear from you where, especially if there are any specific communication, any specific conversations, any influences on Hitler, Goebbels, and any of those people that we should be aware of that maybe triggered a lot of that. Because I think what we want to get to, well, at least what I want to get to, and I know we're running short on time. I want to get to, like, where did the IMT get the right, the International Military Tribunals get the right to impose new types of ethics on people that did not assent to those ethics? Like, how did the whole world identify what evil was? And so I think hopefully that triggering point or something in there, if you could walk us through how we got there, I think that might be helpful for us better understanding how we got to the really, what I would include one of the 2 or 3 most evil activities in human history.
So if you're asking about trigger points for Hitler, Goebbels, and the various others, I think then you dive into their personal biographies, and there are very interesting things that are important there. It's also important to point out that the Nazi Party leadership did not do it alone. They had thousands, tens of thousands, millions of followers, people who voted for them. And they had for many years ahead of time announced exactly what they were going to do. So there was no secret, right, about what was going on there. I would say part of it, though, we can understand ourselves simply by seeing what's going on in the world today, right now, where we have a huge upsurge in Jew hatred. And I don't know what the numbers are, but it's a huge number of apparently educated people at university campuses who are engaged in Jew hunts and willing to do all sorts of nasty and terrible things in civilized countries, right?
Yes.
Apparently, not to speak of what's going on in the Middle East, right, over the course of the last couple of generations. So that exact same religious / ethnic psychology, where again, from the beginning, you are taught it's us versus them, and it's all religiously indoctrinated into the person, and you grow up creating people who are haters by the millions, and people who do not see either themselves or the other as an individual who has any dignity or rights. We are living through a resurgence of that era right now. Now, we go back exactly 100 years to Germany in the 1920s. It's not significantly different. There had been not decades, but centuries of Jew hatred baked into the European conscience over religious issues. And so Christian history has blood on its hands, right? A lot of blood on its hands over the centuries. And so, to its credit, much of Christianity became more humanized and more civilized after the Renaissance and during the Enlightenment. And people started to behave themselves and started to extend rights and tolerance toward Jews, and people were getting along as the 1700s, 1800s, and so forth went on. But there were undercurrents and counter-enlightenments, counter-Renaissance, and resurgences of all sorts of collectivisms and irrationalisms that were going on, especially in Europe in the 1800s and on into the 1900s. So part of it is that there was already a huge, partly religious, partly broader cultural undercurrent that was more than willing, or more, in the 1920s and 1930s, to rekindle all of the old-fashioned Jew hatred and do something about it again in the 30s and the 1940s. So I think that's one important part of the story. I think part of the story does have to do with the personal psychologies of Hitler and Goebbels. As smart as those guys were, I do think they were both very smart, and they were both very well read. Hitler just read all the time. Basically, he had library card memberships when he was a student in Vienna at all of the libraries, and he was always reading and marking stuff up and writing and so forth. It's easy to dismiss him just as a buffoon, right? Just as a theatrical showman. We've all seen the clips of him talking and so forth. But all of that is partly an expression of his personality, but a certain amount of that just is political theater as well. He was smart, he was savvy, he was well read, and he was attracted, I think, partly as a function of his personal psychology, to anything that enabled him to hate certain other peoples, and that he could use as a power lever to get himself further up the ranks. Goebbels, we shouldn't forget that he had a PhD. He was a very well-educated man and had gone to something like 5 different universities in Germany. And getting a PhD from a German university in the 1920s, that's like the gold standard of PhDs at the time. Again, we've seen the clips, and we can see the crazed look in his eye. A certain amount of that is theater, but behind that, there's a lot of smart, well-read strategy, right, at work. So one of the things, and again, this is well worked over territory, is that if you are going to do populist politics, and Germany in the 1920s, it was a republic of sorts, it was a democracy of sorts, And while the Nazis said, we're not at all interested in democracy, right in their 1920 program, they say no, no democracy, no republicanism. We believe in authoritarianism, one man rule. We need to have a Führer type figure and so forth. Nonetheless, they recognized that they were living in a democratic republic, and they knew how to democracy, so to speak. They knew how to do republics, how to marshal mass psychology, how to use all the new technological tools, radio and microphone and mass advertising and so forth. So one of the buttons they know how to push, though, is Jew hatred, right, as a button. Capitalist, rich people hatred as a button. Foreigners coming in here and messing everything up, and knowing how to push that button. Just as politicians who are populist of our own generation continue to learn those tools and apply them in their own way. So there's not a kind of a principled democratic republicanism at work that respects the other. Instead, what you have is mass populist psychology and a recognition strategically of how to use the best new tools to push the buttons of your psychology. And if Jew hatred is one of those effective tools, then push that button really hard.
I've got one quick final question for you. I think, and let me just preface this by responding to one of the comments you made about religion. I think a lot of folks from the Christian tradition would assert that the anti-Christian attributes by the religious in Germany throughout a number of centuries against the Jews, against the Muslims in other parts of the world, that those were religious activities, not Christian activities, because they were antithetical to the teachings of Christ. I often forget that it was the religious people that killed Christ. And so I think I think you're right. We've got to be wary when we see the religions executing this sort of evil. We know that they've sort of strayed from the mores, that these are not the traditional types of religious folk. These are sort of a radicalized people that are willing to tilt the scoreboard wherever is convenient for them at times. And I think that was unfortunate. So I personally, I'm ashamed by the way that the Christian churches reacted in Germany in the 1930s. Yeah, I mean, you had some outliers like Bonhoeffer, but besides that, it's been tragic. One final question. I want to you've written 7 books, and you're all over your lecture series. We talked about your lecture series on Peterson Academy. You have quite the creative process. Would you just give me an idea about a day that you're writing a book? How many hours you're writing? What's your use of caffeine? Do you write in Google Docs or Word? Like, just kind of give me the
nitty gritty, huh?
Yeah.
Well, sometimes I think I'm a pretty lazy guy because I do. Fortunately, where we live, I can go for long walks in the woods, and I like to watch movies and spend time with my wife. And so there are long stretches of time where I'm not particularly productive. At the same time, I think philosophy and I love history. It's in my blood enough that, in effect, there's always stuff percolating, and I'm always thinking about things, even while doing various other activities and so forth. But that's a bit of a flip answer, because at the same time, I do like thinking. I love philosophy. I do enjoy writing, and while writing a book sometimes has its torture elements at various stages during the process, I'm willing to embrace those as part of the overall process. But I suppose if you want to get down to nitty gritties, when I'm not traveling, my routine is basically just to get up when I get up in the morning, and usually that's a little bit after the sun is coming up. Kind of to see some sort of light figure, and then I do have significant caffeine. I like to get up and make a big pot of coffee and go to my writing chair, which is a very comfortable chair, and then open up my computer. Most days, this is a kind of discipline point. I make myself ignore email, ignore social media, and just start drinking coffee and looking at my notes, and whatever I've been thinking about, just start to write about that.
Yeah.
If I'm in the early stages, it will be more scattered and a little bit here, a little bit there. If it's a more systematic thing, then I pick up where I left off the previous day. Typically, I will go until late morning and then break for lunch. And then after that, there are really no bets or all bets are off about what I will be doing next. Sometimes I'll do more writing. Sometimes I'll do email. There's always travel things and speaking commitments in the offing that need some administration, or just other life things will catch my attention, and that's what I do. So basically, I'm a kind of a mid to late morning, get the work done kind of guy.
Yes, yes, that's cool. That's cool. So I mentioned 7 books. We're gonna link to them all below in the description. Where's the best place for folks to just to follow your work? Where are you most active online?
Well, I have my personal professional website, stephenhicks.org. And so kind of announcements and links to my publications and stuff goes up there. I have a Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship. I started at my university about 17 or 18 years ago, and it was a teaching and research institution where we did a lot of curricular reform and experimenting with the new educational technologies. So we did a lot of video work, a lot of podcast work. It was called Center for Ethics and Entrepreneurship because we were very interested in ethics issues and entrepreneurship, as the name suggests. But it's expanded to be a general purpose philosophy, intellectual history, business ethics, entrepreneurship, business, and so forth channel. Or we just call it CEE Video Channel. It's now dissociated. It's a separate entity from the university. So I would say start there. And you did mention Peterson Academy. Yes, thank you for that. That's a very exciting startup venture. One of the things I've been thinking a lot about the last few years is what higher education will look like in 10 years, given all of the new technologies, given the student loan crisis, given the economies of scale, given the changing demographics and so forth. So Peterson Academy, and of course, all of the ideological problems. We want to have people actually getting an education instead of indoctrination. So Peterson Academy, I think, is a very well conceived way of trying to reinvent one new model of higher education. And so I was very gratified that they've invited me to teach some courses, one on postmodern philosophy and one on modern philosophy, my kind of bread and butter areas of intellectual expertise. So for a more systematic study of what's been going on in the philosophical world for the last few centuries, I would recommend, check me out at Peterson Academy, those courses there.
We'll do that. We'll do that. Dr. Hicks, thanks so much for your time and for blessing us with your wisdom on all things, everything from Nazi to evil to the goodness of the human condition whenever it occasionally peeks through the clouds. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, thanks so much for chiming in today. Thanks a lot.